My name is Eloan Ellington, or at least it used to be. Before everything changed, before the world saw me for who I really was, I was just a ghost sitting at my own family dinner table. The table itself was a testament to the Ellington image, a vast, gleaming slab of mahogany that my father, Richard, had imported from some exotic, far-off land. It was a table built for dynasties, for families of substance. But for me, it was a battlefield, a courtroom, and a prison, all rolled into one. And that night, I was about to receive a life sentence. The air in our dining room was always thick, heavy with the scent of my mother's expensive perfume and unspoken resentments. The chandelier above us, a monstrosity of crystal and gold, dripped light onto the table, but it always felt like the light chose to illuminate everything but me. It danced off my sister Seraphina's perfectly blonde hair. It gleamed on my father's signet ring as he swirled his wine, and it reflected in my mother Caroline's ever-watchful, calculating eyes. I sat in a pocket of shadow, a silent observer in the theater of my own family. Tonight's performance was, as always, the Seraphina show. "James and I are thinking Lake Como for the wedding," she announced, her voice a melody of casual entitlement. "His family has a villa there, of course, but we want something that's ours, you know? A fresh start." She took a delicate sip of her Chardonnay, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of her own perfect life. My mother clasped her hands together, her smile so wide it looked painful. "Oh, Seraphina, darling, that's marvelous. Absolutely marvelous. Your father and I were just saying how proud we are of your new promotion. Vice President before 30. It's simply unheard of." My father nodded, the corner of his mouth ticking up in a rare display of approval. "Good instincts. Strong portfolio. That's my girl." The praise washed over Seraphina, and she basked in it like a cat in a sunbeam. She was the family's golden child, the sun around which we all were expected to orbit. Her successes were family successes. Her happiness was the family's priority. My existence, on the other hand, was more of an administrative footnote, a line item on a budget they'd rather not have to deal with. I pushed a single green bean around my plate with the tines of my sterling silver fork. The clinking sound was too loud in the brief lull of conversation. All eyes turned to me. It was that dreaded moment, the one where they remembered I was there and felt obligated to include me, if only for a second. "And you, Eloan?" my mother asked, her tone bright and forced. "How are things with your little computer projects?" My heart gave a stupid, hopeful little flutter. Maybe tonight would be different. "It's going well, actually. The predictive algorithm I've been developing for supply chain logistics, it's finally starting to produce results with less than a 0.1% margin of error. It could be revolutionary for—" I trailed off. Seraphina was examining her manicure with an expression of profound boredom. My father had already picked up his wine glass again, his gaze distant. And my mother! She was smiling that fixed, vacant smile, her eyes darting toward my sister, already searching for a way to pivot the conversation back to something that mattered. "That's nice, dear," she said, her voice a silken dismissal. "Speaking of revolutionary, Seraphina, did you decide on a designer for your dress?" And just like that, I was gone again, erased. The momentary flicker of hope died in my chest, leaving the familiar, cold ache of invisibility. I retreated back into my shadows, listening as they dissected the merits of Verawang versus Marquesa. I didn't exist in this world of luxury brands and European villas. I lived in a world of code, of late nights fueled by cheap coffee, of building something complex and beautiful that they would never, ever understand. They saw a nerdy hobby, I saw my escape route. I just didn't know how soon I'd have to use it. The main course was cleared away, and a decadent chocolate lava cake was served. It was as Seraphina was taking her first bite, a look of sublime satisfaction on her face, that she decided to deliver the killing blow. She set her spoon down, a thoughtful, almost concerned expression arranging itself on her features. It was the face she wore when she was about to be her most cruel. "Mummy, Daddy," she began, her tone grave. "James and I were talking the other night about the future, about finances." She glanced at me, just for a second, a flicker of something sharp and predatory in her eyes. "You've both worked so hard to build this life, to build this family's wealth. We need to make sure it's secure for your retirement. We need to start thinking about streamlining things, cutting down on unnecessary expenses." My father leaned forward, intrigued. This was his language. ROI, assets, liabilities. "What do you have in mind?" Serafina took a deep breath, the picture of a dutiful daughter concerned for her parents' well-being. "Well, for starters, there are some financial drains that we've all just sort of accepted over the years." She let the statement hang in the air. The silence in the room became a ringing in my ears. I knew where this was going. I felt the floor drop out from beneath me, but on the outside I remained perfectly still. Then she turned her full attention to me. Her voice was no longer sweet or melodic. It was flat, cold, and brutally precise. "Honestly, Eloan," she said, her lips curving into a smug, pitying smile. "You are a burden. We want to live our lives without you holding us back." The words hit me, not like a slap, but like the slow, silent pressure of a deep-sea dive, crushing the air from my lungs. A burden. It was the single word that had defined my entire existence in this house, the unspoken truth that had haunted every ignored achievement, every forgotten birthday, every condescending smile. And now it was out, spoken, real. But the words themselves weren't the worst part. The worst part was the silence that followed. I looked at my father. He stared down at his dessert, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. He didn't defend me. He didn't refute her. He was a businessman evaluating a liability, and he had just heard a compelling argument for a write-off. I looked at my mother. She stared at a point just over my shoulder, her expression carefully, meticulously blank. She was a socialite protecting her perfect image, and a scene would have ruined the evening. Her silence wasn't just agreement. It was a plea for me to disappear quietly and not cause a fuss. In that crushing, deafening silence, 24 years of trying to earn their love finally crumbled to dust. The desperate little girl inside me, who brought home perfect report cards and hoped for a pat on the head, finally gave up. The pain that had been a constant, dull ache in my chest for 2 decades didn't explode. It did something far stranger. It froze. A wave of absolute, chilling clarity washed over me. It was like emerging from a fever dream into a world that was suddenly, starkly in focus. These people were not my family, not in any way that mattered. They were my investors, and they had just declared my stock worthless. They were my wardens, and they had just confirmed I was nothing more than a line in their budget. And you don't try to win the love of your wardens. You just plan your escape. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a single tear. Instead, a strange, terrifying calm settled over me. I slowly, deliberately, picked up my heavy linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table beside my untouched cake. The sound of the fabric on the wood was the only noise in the room. I pushed my chair back. The scrape of its legs against the polished floor was a thunderclap in the silence. 3 pairs of eyes were on me now, confused, irritated. They were expecting an outburst, a dramatic scene, something they could dismiss as me being overly sensitive. I gave them nothing. I stood up, smoothed down my simple dress, and turned. I walked out of the dining room, my steps even and measured. I walked through the grand foyer, past the portraits of my ancestors who looked down with the same indifferent eyes as my parents. I didn't look back. I knew what I would see. 3 people already convincing themselves that this was just another one of my moods, that I'd be back in my room later, ready to be ignored all over again. They were wrong. That was the last sentence my family ever said to me in that house. Their silence was my answer, and my quiet exit was my declaration of war. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, hit that like button and subscribe, because you will not believe what I did the very next day. To understand what happened the next day, You have to understand the 24 years that came before it. My exit from that dining room wasn't a spontaneous act of rebellion. It was the final, quiet click of a lock I had been building my entire life. My family saw a sensitive girl having a tantrum. They had no idea they were looking at a ghost they had created, a ghost who had spent years meticulously planning her own haunting. The architecture of my neglect was built brick by brick, year by year, with the mortar of their indifference and the cold steel of their expectations. It was a masterfully constructed prison, and to appreciate the escape, you have to appreciate the design of the cage. It all started with the simple, damning contrast between the sun and the shadow, between the golden child and the ghost. My sister, Serafina, was born into the light. From her first breath, she was an asset, a reflection of my parents' own perceived brilliance. I, on the other hand, was born 2 years later into her shadow, and it was a shadow from which I was never allowed to emerge. Our childhoods were a case study in this divergence. 2 parallel lives lived under the same roof, but in entirely different universes. The year I turned 16 was a masterclass in Ellington family values. 3 months before my birthday, the planning for Serafina's 18th began. It was less a party and more a coronation. My mother, Caroline, hired an event planner who spoke in hushed, reverent tones about things like ambience and couture floral arrangements. A massive white marquee was erected on our sprawling lawn, looking like a cathedral to teenage vanity. For weeks, our house was a flurry of caterers, designers, and florists. My father, Richard, had commissioned a string quartet. The guest list was a who's who of our town's elite, every invitation a carefully calculated move on my parents' social chessboard. The centerpiece of the evening, the grand reveal, was the car, a brand-new, pearl-white convertible, which my father had parked just out of sight, ready to be presented with a flourish. Serafina, of course, acted surprised, letting out a perfectly pitched shriek of delight as the local newspaper photographer captured the moment for the society pages. It was a flawless performance, a public declaration of her worth. She was an investment, and this was the celebration of her soaring stock value. 3 months later, my 16th birthday arrived. The marquee was long gone. The caterer's numbers had been filed away. The house was quiet. I woke up that morning with a knot of dread in my stomach, a familiar feeling I had learned to associate with any day that was supposed to be about me. I came downstairs for breakfast. My mother was on the phone, discussing a charity gala. My father was reading the Wall Street Journal. Neither of them looked up. Serafina breezed past, complaining about a smudge on her new car's bumper. No one said a word. The silence was absolute. I ate my toast in that silence, the knot in my stomach tightening with every quiet bite. They had forgotten. It wasn't until that evening, as we sat down for dinner, that my mother's eyes suddenly widened in a moment of horrified realization. "Oh, goodness, Eloan, it's your birthday. With all the commotion from Serafina's party, oh, your father and I are just dreadful." She rushed from the room and returned with a small, hastily wrapped box. It contained a gift card to a national bookstore chain. "We didn't have time to shop, dear, but we know how much you love your little books." My father grunted his assent from behind his newspaper. "Happy birthday," he mumbled, his eyes never leaving the stock market report. I remember looking at the plastic card in my hand, a $50 voucher for a place I could go to be alone, and feeling nothing but a vast, hollow emptiness. Serafina got a public coronation. I got an afterthought, a transaction to clear their conscience. The message was clear. She was worth celebrating. I was worth a receipt. This dynamic bled into every corner of our lives, especially our education. My father saw our schooling not as a path to enlightenment, but as a training ground for future assets. Serafina, despite her charm, was never a naturally gifted student. I remember vividly the crisis that erupted when she brought home a C+ in economics. A family emergency was declared. My father, who had never once attended a parent-teacher conference for me, was on the phone for an hour with her professor. The city's most expensive and sought-after tutor was hired, a man who charged more per hour than most people make in a day. My mother began a regimen of what she called brain food, preparing salmon and blueberry smoothies to ensure Serafina's mind was operating at peak performance. Her C+ was treated like a corporate crisis, a temporary dip in a valuable stock that required immediate and substantial investment to correct. 2 years later, I entered a prestigious national mathematics competition. It was an exam so notoriously difficult that most universities used it to identify truly exceptional minds. I didn't tell my parents I was doing it. I knew they wouldn't understand. I just spent weeks in my room, a ghost in the attic, surrounded by textbooks and complex equations, feeling the thrill of my own mind at work. When the results came back, I had achieved a perfect score. I was one of only a handful of students in the entire country to do so. For a fleeting, foolish moment, I thought this will be the thing. They can't ignore this. I found my father in his study, poring over financial reports. I held out the certificate, my hands trembling slightly. It was on heavy parchment, embossed with the university's crest, my name printed in elegant calligraphy next to the words "Perfect Score." He took it, glanced at it for no more than 3 seconds, and handed it back. "Good," he said, his voice flat, his attention already returning to the spreadsheet on his monitor. "Make sure your room is clean before dinner." That was it. No questions, no praise, no acknowledgement of the sheer scale of the achievement. It was a data point that didn't fit into his calculations. Serafina's academic mediocrity was a problem to be solved with money and attention. My genius, because it was quiet, introverted, and didn't translate into the kind of social capital he valued, had no market value. It was, to him, completely worthless. But Serafina's cruelty was more than just basking in the sunlight of our parents' favoritism. She was an active participant in maintaining the shadows where I lived. She saw my quiet resilience not as a strength, but as a silent judgment on her own superficiality, and she made it her mission to extinguish any small spark of light I managed to find for myself. When I was 14, our school held an annual science fair. I decided to build a detailed working model of a planetary orrery with tiny, intricate gears I had fashioned myself that allowed the planets to rotate around the sun at their correct relative speeds. It was my masterpiece. I spent nearly a month on it, hunched over my desk night after night, lost in the beautiful, predictable mathematics of the cosmos. I was proud of it. For the first time, I had created something tangible, something undeniably impressive. The night before the fair, I put the finishing touches on it. It sat on my desk, a miniature solar system gleaming under my lamp. I went to bed, feeling a rare sense of excitement. In the morning, I found it destroyed. A bottle of my sister's bright red nail polish remover had been spilled all over the central gear mechanism, melting the delicate plastic cogs into a useless, warped clump. The tiny planets lay scattered, their orbits broken. My miniature universe was dead. Serafina stood in my doorway, a vision of carefully constructed remorse. Tears welled in her eyes as she explained that she'd been looking for a book on my shelf and had accidentally knocked the bottle over. It was a flawless performance. Our parents rushed in, saw her tears, and immediately went to comfort her. My mother chided me for leaving my mess out where it could get damaged. My father told me it was a lesson in risk management. They bought her story without a single question, because in their world, Serafina was charming and a little clumsy, while I was difficult and overly sensitive. The thought that their golden child could be capable of such calculated, petty malice was an idea their curated reality could not accommodate. I never told them I had found the spilled bottle placed perfectly upright on my shelf, its cap loosely screwed on. I just cleaned up the mess, threw my dead universe in the trash, and went to school with nothing to present. I learned a valuable lesson that day. My victories were a threat, and my sister would always be there to neutralize them. Looking back, I can see them not as monsters, but as what they truly were, pathologically limited human beings. My father, Richard, was a man who had successfully translated the entire world into a spreadsheet. Love, family, friendship, these were all just variables in a complex equation of profit and loss. He measured worth in terms of financial success and public perception. Serafina, with her easy charm, her prestigious connections, and her ability to network, was a blue-chip stock, a guaranteed return on investment. Her successes were his successes, a validation of his own ruthless worldview. I, the quiet observer, the introvert who preferred books to boardrooms, was a junk bond. I was an unpredictable asset with low liquidity and no discernible market value. He wasn't cruel in a theatrical way. His neglect was the cold, dispassionate decision of a fund manager cutting his losses. I overheard him on the phone once, discussing a long-time employee he had just fired. He was a good man, my father said, but his sentimentality was affecting the bottom line. Emotions are a liability in a negotiation. He raised his children by that same creed. My emotional needs were a liability, so he simply stopped negotiating with them. My mother, Caroline, operated on a different but equally devastating calculus, the balance sheet of appearances. Our family was not a collection of people to be loved. It was a curated exhibit to be admired. Her entire life was a performance, and her children were her most important props. Serafina was the perfect prop, beautiful, socially adept, and always camera-ready. I was not. I was quiet where Serafina was loud. I was observant where she was performative. My silence made her uncomfortable because it couldn't be controlled or curated. I remember for our annual family Christmas card, she would physically position us, pushing Serafina slightly in front of me, telling her to smile brightly while telling me to try and look a little less serious. It wasn't about our happiness. It was about the composition of the photo. Her love wasn't a source of warmth. It was a form of public relations. And my quiet, analytical nature was bad PR. Her silence at that final dinner wasn't just agreement with Serafina's words. It was the panicked reaction of a director whose least favorite actor was about to ruin the final scene. So, while they were busy managing their assets and curating their exhibits, I was building my escape route in the one place they never thought to look, my own mind. My passion for computers, which they dismissed as a nerdy hobby, became my sanctuary. In the clean, irrefutable logic of code, I found a peace that our chaotic, emotionally bankrupt house could never provide. Ones and zeros didn't lie. Algorithms didn't have favorites. The results were based on merit, not on charm. My bedroom, and later my cramped dorm room at college, became my secret laboratory. While my family slept, I was awake, bathed in the blue glow of my monitors, building worlds they couldn't imagine. It was in college that I met Liam and Maya. They were the first people in my life who didn't look at me with confusion. They looked at me and saw, simply me. Liam was a hardware savant, a quiet genius who could coax a network server into existence from a pile of spare parts and sheer force of will. Maya was a force of nature, a brilliant strategist with an intuitive understanding of people that bordered on psychic. She saw the human story behind the data. While my family saw a liability, they saw a visionary. One night, fueled by stale pizza and cheap coffee in Liam's dorm room, I sketched out my idea on a whiteboard. It was a concept born from years of being an observer, of seeing the patterns that other people missed. I had identified a critical inefficiency in global supply chains, a blind spot that was costing companies billions. I proposed a new kind of predictive AI, an algorithm that could see the future of logistics with near-perfect accuracy. Liam and Maya didn't dismiss it. They didn't call it a little project. Their eyes lit up. That night, Ether Analytics was born. The three of us became a single entity, a three-headed dragon of ambition and innovation, hidden away from the world. We lived on ramen noodles and boundless optimism. We pooled our student loan money to buy our first server rack. We worked in 20-hour shifts coding, building, and refining. I was living a double life. By day, when I came home for holidays, I was the quiet, burdensome daughter, the ghost at the mahogany table. But by night, I was the CEO and chief architect of a revolutionary tech company, leading my tiny, brilliant team in a silent war against the impossible. It wasn't easy. There were moments where the pressure felt like a physical weight trying to crush me. I remember one night, a catastrophic server crash wiped out 2 weeks of nonstop work. We had a critical demo for a potential seed investor the next day. All seemed lost. Liam was pale, Maya was fighting back tears, and I felt that old, familiar coldness of defeat creeping in. I almost gave up. I thought of my father's dismissive face, of my sister's cruel smirk. I pictured them at their dinner table, talking about my failure as just another example of my inadequacy. And that image, that memory of their disdain, became my fuel. The pain they had inflicted upon me for years wasn't a wound anymore. It was a weapon. I took a deep breath, looked at my exhausted friends, and said, "Get the coffee. We're rebuilding it from scratch. Tonight." We did. We worked through the night, our fingers flying across keyboards, rebuilding the entire code base from memory and archived fragments. We finished with 7 minutes to spare. We were exhausted, running on pure adrenaline, but we were victorious. We didn't just rebuild the code, we made it better. That investor demo secured our first round of funding. It was the first brick in the foundation of my new life. It was a victory they would never know about, a testament to a resilience they had unintentionally forged in me through years of trying to break me down. They thought they were raising a burden. They had no idea they were training a titan. When the heavy oak door of the Ellington mansion clicked shut behind me, the sound didn't feel like a closing. It felt like an opening. It was the sound of a caged door swinging wide, the sound of a book snapping shut on a terrible chapter, the sound of a starting gun firing into the silent night. For a single, suspended moment, I stood on the top step of the porch, the grand, imposing columns of my former prison flanking me like silent, defeated sentinels. I didn't look back. I knew there was nothing there for me. The first thing that hit me was the air. Inside, the air was always the same, recycled, temperature-controlled, and thick with the cloying scent of my mother's potpourri and my father's expensive cigars. It was the dead air of a museum. But out here, the night air was alive. It was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the sweet, heavy perfume of night-blooming jasmine from our neighbor's meticulously kept garden. I took a breath, a real one, a deep, lung-expanding gulp of freedom that felt more nourishing than any meal I'd ever eaten at that mahogany table. It tasted like reality. And then I began to walk. It wasn't a flight. It wasn't the frantic, panicked scramble of someone running away. My steps were even, my pace deliberate. My worn-out sneakers made a soft, rhythmic sound on the perfectly paved sidewalk of our exclusive, manicured street. Each house was a fortress of wealth, set far back from the road, their windows glowing with warm, golden light, projecting images of perfect, happy families. I had lived my whole life inside one of those projections, and I knew the rot that festered behind the pristine facade. I was walking away from the lie. Each step was a conscious act of severance. The soft crunch of a fallen leaf under my shoe was me crushing 20 years of being told to be quieter. The feeling of the gentle breeze on my face was me wiping away the memory of their indifferent stares. The distant hum of the city, a sound I could never hear from the insulated walls of my room, was the song of my future. I wasn't just walking away from a house. I was walking out of the narrative they had written for me. The character of Eloin, the burden, died the moment I stood up from that table. The person walking down this dark, tree-lined street was someone new. She was just Eloin, and she was the author of her own story now. I felt a pang, but it wasn't grief. It was something sharper, more analytical. It was the ghost of the girl I used to be, mourning the colossal waste of energy, the thousands of hours I had spent trying to decrypt the unsolvable puzzle of my family's love. I had treated their approval like a complex coding problem, believing that if I just found the right variable, the right input, I could generate the desired output, a perfect report card, a quiet demeanor, an unquestioning obedience. But it was a flawed premise from the start. There was no code to crack. There was no love to be earned. There was only the cold, hard reality of their balance sheet. And the grief for that wasted effort was quickly being burned away by the cold, clean fire of my resolve. My family, in their infinite arrogance, probably assumed I was wandering aimlessly, that I'd end up at a bus station or, if I was lucky, the home of my one or two tolerated friends. They pictured me crying lost and regretting my dramatic outburst. They would imagine me, sooner or later, realizing the coldness of the real world and crawling back, tail between my legs, ready to apologize for the inconvenience I had caused. Their blindness was their greatest weakness. They had never once bothered to truly look at me, to see the person who existed behind the quiet facade they found so disappointing. They had no idea I wasn't wandering. I had a destination. After a 20-minute walk, I turned onto a street that was the complete antithesis of my family's neighborhood. The grand, sprawling mansions gave way to a sleek, modern, and anonymous-looking apartment building. It was elegant but understated, a place designed for privacy, not for showing off. I walked into the brightly lit lobby, the scent of clean steel and glass replacing the jasmine and damp earth. I didn't go to the concierge. I walked to a discreet side elevator, pulled a simple, unmarked key card from the hidden pocket of my jacket and swiped it. The elevator doors slid open with a soft whoosh. This key card had been in my possession for 3 months. My departure wasn't an escape, it was a relocation. The elevator opened directly into my apartment on the 7th floor, and as I stepped inside, the full reality of my new life settled over me. This was my sanctuary, where the Ellington mansion was a chaotic symphony of my mother's opulent, cluttered taste. Heavy drapes, ornate furniture, gilded frames, and porcelain figures that were never to be touched. This apartment was a haven of minimalist calm. The walls were stark white. The floors were polished concrete. There was no furniture, save for a simple, ergonomic desk in the corner and a high-quality mattress on the floor. There were no decorations except for the sprawling 6-foot whiteboard mounted on the main wall, a chaotic and beautiful tapestry of complex algorithms, flowcharts, and market projections, all written in my own frantic script. This space was a physical manifestation of my mind. It was clean, it was logical, and it was entirely my own. There was no history here, no ghosts of past disappointments. There was only the future. I dropped the small backpack I had packed, containing only my laptop, 3 essential textbooks, and a change of clothes, onto the floor. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window that made up the far wall. The view was breathtaking. The city spread out before me like a glittering circuit board, a vast network of light and energy. From my family's house, you could only see other, equally large houses. From here, I could see everything. I had leased this apartment 2 months ago, using a carefully allocated portion of the first round of seed money from Ether Analytics. Liam and Maya had thought I was being paranoid, but I knew my family. I knew that the end game of my life with them would be an expulsion, not a gentle parting of ways. I called it my emancipation protocol. This apartment was phase 1. It wasn't just a place to live. It was a strategic outpost. It was a clean room, a secure location from which I could launch the rest of my life. My family had no idea it existed. As far as they were concerned, I had no money of my own, no resources, no ability to survive without their help. They had built their narrative of my incompetence so thoroughly that they had started to believe it themselves. I stood at that window for a long time, just watching the river of headlights flowing on the freeway below. I wasn't scared. I wasn't sad. I felt a profound, almost unnerving sense of peace. The burden was gone. The weight of their expectations, the constant, grinding effort of trying to be someone they could love. It had all vanished the moment that front door clicked shut. I was late. I was free. After a few more minutes, I turned from the window. The adrenaline of the evening was starting to coalesce into a sharp, focused energy. It was time. I pulled out my phone. Not the one my parents paid for, which I had left on my nightstand in the Ellington mansion, but a clean, encrypted burner phone I had purchased with cash. I scrolled to my contacts. There were only 2 names, Liam and Maya. I initiated a conference call. They picked up on the first ring. Eloan. It was Maya's voice, low and tense. Are you okay? We saw you went offline. I'm okay, I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil of the past hour. I'm more than okay. I'm out. There was a moment of silence on the other end. And then Liam spoke, his voice filled with a quiet concern that felt more familial than anything I had ever received from my own blood. Are you sure? There's no going back from this, you know that. I looked around my empty, perfect sanctuary. I looked at the whiteboard, at the beautiful language of my life's work. I thought of the cold, dismissive faces around that mahogany table. I'm sure, I said, and the words were like steel. It's done. Maya took a sharp breath. Okay, she said, her voice shifting from concerned friend to sharp, strategic partner. Okay, what do you need from us? This was it, the point of no return, the moment where my personal freedom became a corporate action. It's time, I said, my voice dropping, filled with the cold, hard certainty I had been storing up for years. Initiate the final phase. I hung up the phone. The silence that filled the apartment now was different. It wasn't empty. It was the charged, humming silence of a machine that has just been activated. It was the silence of a countdown timer reaching 0. Somewhere in a secure data center that Liam had built, a series of automated protocols were now in motion. Emails were being queued. Legal documents were being dispatched to encrypted servers. A carefully constructed cascade of information was about to be unleashed. The events of the next day were already in motion. My family thought I was having a teenage tantrum. They assumed I'd come crawling back. They had no idea I wasn't running from them. I was running toward my real life. What do you think was going through their minds that night? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. While I was breathing the clean, sterile air of my future, the inhabitants of my past were waking up to their last day of blissful ignorance. I can picture the scene in the Ellington mansion that next morning with perfect clarity, pieced together from years of observation and the panicked, fragmented accounts I would hear much, much later. The atmosphere at the breakfast table would not have been one of worry. Worry would imply that they cared for my well-being. No, the atmosphere would have been one of supreme annoyance. I had disrupted the sacred, immutable routine of their lives, and for that there would be consequences. My mother, Caroline, would have been fluttering around the kitchen, her movements sharp and agitated, complaining to the housekeeper about how my stunt was going to make them late for their respective appointments. My father, Richard, would be sitting at the head of that cursed mahogany table, hidden behind the pink pages of the Financial Times, his silence a heavy, disapproving blanket over the room. He wouldn't be worried about his daughter. He'd be irritated that a domestic issue was distracting him from the market's opening bell. And then there would be Serafina. She would have swept in, glowing and refreshed, enjoying the drama, the sole focus of all their attention once again. She would have poured herself a coffee, a smug little smile playing on her lips. "Has the prodigal daughter returned yet?" she would have asked, her voice dripping with mock concern. My mother would have sighed, pressing her fingers to her temples. Not a word. I swear, that girl. The drama. What are we supposed to tell the Abernethys? We have brunch with them on Sunday. I can't very well say our youngest daughter has run away because her sister was giving her some sound financial advice. We tell them nothing. My father would have rumbled from behind his paper, not bothering to lower it. She'll be back by tonight. I'll cancel her credit card. When the money runs out, the tantrum ends. It's a simple equation. That's when Serafina would have laughed, a sound as bright and sharp as breaking glass. Honestly, how long do you think she'll last? 5 minutes? I bet she's already at a bus station crying because she doesn't know how to buy a ticket. The girls never had to do a single thing for herself. The real world is going to eat her alive. They would have all nodded in agreement, secure in their shared narrative. Eloin, the fragile, incompetent burden. Eloin, the girl who couldn't survive without them. It was the foundation of their family dynamic, the central pillar holding up the cathedral of their superiority. And it was about to be reduced to rubble. The disruption arrived at precisely 9:15 a.m. It wasn't a police car, as my mother might have secretly feared, nor was it a tearful taxi ride bringing me home, as my father confidently expected. It was a vehicle that did not belong in their world of manicured lawns and old money. A sleek, black sedan with tinted windows, utterly silent and menacingly discreet, purred to a stop at the end of their long, winding driveway. A man emerged from the passenger side. He wasn't a delivery driver in a wrinkled uniform. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his movements economical and precise. He carried a slim, leather briefcase. He walked up the stone path, his polished shoes making no sound, and rang the doorbell. The housekeeper answered, and the man simply stated his purpose in a calm, level voice. I have a delivery for Richard Ellington, Caroline Ellington, and Serafina Ellington. I am required to hand it to them personally. His formality was the first crack in their armor of annoyance. This was unusual. This was a deviation from the script. My father, annoyed at being disturbed, came to the door, with my mother and sister trailing behind him like ladies-in-waiting. The man in the suit looked at each of them, his expression unreadable. He opened his briefcase and produced 3 identical, heavyweight envelopes. They were made of thick, creamy cardstock, the kind used for state dinners or hostile takeover bids. My family's full, legal names were written on the front of each in stunning, merciless calligraphy. The man held them out. Mr. Richard Ellington, Mrs. Caroline Ellington, Ms. Serafina Ellington. He handed each envelope to its intended recipient. My service is complete. He gave a curt, professional nod, turned, and walked back to the silent black car without another word. In less than a minute, the car was gone, leaving the 3 of them standing in the grand marble foyer, each holding a package that felt less like a letter and more like a bomb. The suspense, I imagine, was unbearable. They retreated to the dining room, the scene of the crime, and stood around the table, placing the envelopes on the polished mahogany surface as if they were sacred, terrifying artifacts. A bluff? A desperate plea for attention? A letter from a lawyer I had scraped together? Their minds would have been racing, but none of their theories could have possibly prepared them for the reality they held in their hands. My father, ever the pragmatist, was the first to act. "Let's get this over with," he grumbled, tearing his open with his thumb. My mother and sister followed suit, the sound of ripping paper echoing in the cavernous room. They would have pulled out the contents simultaneously. 3 separate documents, each nestled within the envelope. And as they laid them out, their world began to unravel, piece by devastating piece. The first document was the coldest. It was a single page on a letterhead of Farrow, Lynch, and Sterling, a law firm so powerful and so ruthless that my father had spoken of them with a kind of fearful reverence. It was a firm you hired when you wanted to annihilate your opponent, not just defeat them. The language was not emotional. It was the brutal, sterile prose of the law. I can see my father's eyes scanning it, his brow furrowing as he processed the legalese. Formal disassociation, pursuant to client's request, relinquishment of the Ellington surname. Hereby cease any and all claims of familial relation, financial or otherwise. My mother's hand would have flown to her mouth. Disassociation? What on earth does that mean? Is that even legal? Her voice would have been a panicked whisper. She wouldn't have understood the legal mechanics, but she would have understood the social implications. It was a formal declaration of war, a public shunning. Serafina would have scoffed, though the sound would have been thin, brittle. It's a bluff, a pathetic cry for attention. Where would she even get the money to hire a firm like this? But her question would hang in the air unanswered, because their eyes would have already moved to the second document. And this one was the tactical nuke. It was printed on glossy, high-quality paper, a pullout from a prestigious, invitation-only tech journal. The masthead read Future Forward, the business of innovation. And below it, the headline, printed in a bold, authoritative font, a headline that was about to shatter their entire reality. Global logistics giant Intercorp acquires AI startup Ether Analytics in landmark $350 million deal. The number would have hung in the air, shimmering impossible. $350 million, a sum so vast it was an abstraction. My father's breath would have caught in his throat. His business mind, faster than any calculator, would have been racing, trying to process the scale of it. Intercorp was a titan. This wasn't some minor league deal. This was front-page news in the world he revered. Their eyes would have scanned the article, a blur of words like disruptive technology, paradigm shift, and next-generation predictive modeling. And then they would have seen the paragraph that listed the founders. Liam Chin, Maya Singh, and the third name, the name that would have made the world tilt on its axis. The company's CEO and chief architect, Eloan, not Eloan Ellington, just Eloan. To the right of the text was a photograph, and this, perhaps, was the most shocking blow of all. It wasn't a picture of the quiet, withdrawn girl with the downcast eyes they thought they knew. The woman in the photograph was a stranger to them. Her hair, which my mother always told me to do something with, was styled in a sharp, professional cut. She was wearing a tailored navy blue blazer, her posture radiating a calm, unshakable confidence. Her eyes, the same eyes they had dismissed for 24 years, looked directly into the camera, clear, intelligent, and utterly in control. A faint, knowing smile played on her lips. It was the smile of a queen who had just checkmated the world. It was the face of a person they had never, ever met. I can picture the scene perfectly. The blood draining from my mother's face, my father's hand, holding the paper, beginning to tremble, and Serafina. Serafina's face would have been a mask of utter disbelief, her brain short-circuiting, unable to reconcile the image of the powerful CEO in the photo with the pathetic burden she had mocked less than an hour ago. And just as they were reeling from that, their stunned fingers would have found the third and final item in the envelope. This one was the most personal. This was the poetic justice. It was a single, large photograph, printed on thick, gallery-quality stock. The image was of a house, if you could call it that. It was more like a sculpture of glass and white stone, perched on a cliff overlooking the city. An infinity pool stretched out towards the horizon, its surface a perfect, unbroken mirror of the sky. It was a monument to modern architecture, a palace of wealth and taste that made their grand, stuffy mansion look like a relic from a forgotten era. It was, in every conceivable way, more impressive, more expensive, and more beautiful. Their hands would have trembled as they turned the photograph over. On the back, written in my own familiar looping script, was a single sentence. Funny what a burden can build when she's left alone. My new address for your records. The bomb had been dropped. The silence that followed would have been absolute, a vacuum where their old reality had once been. And then the fallout would have begun, each of them reacting according to their own flawed, broken programming. My father would have been the first to recover, his shock immediately transmuting into something else, something cold and calculating. He would have looked at the press release again, not with the eyes of a father, but with the eyes of a venture capitalist who had just discovered a Rembrandt in his attic that he'd been using as a dartboard. The number, $350 million. His mind would be a flurry of calculations. What was her stake? How much was liquid? How could this be leveraged? A twisted, predatory, sort of pride would have started to bloom in his chest. Not for me, the person, but for the asset. He had created this. His genes, his house, his neglect, he might even argue, was the crucible that had forged her. His immediate thought would not be of reconciliation. It would be of acquisition. How could he get a piece of this? How could he reestablish a connection to this newfound, impossibly valuable asset? My mother's reaction would have been a supernova of social horror. The legal letter, the press release, the mansion. This wasn't a private family matter anymore. This was public. The tech world would be talking about it, which meant the financial world would be talking about it, which meant their entire social circle would be talking about it. The story was too good, too scandalous. The neglected daughter who secretly became a multimillionaire. They would be a laughingstock. The Ellingtons, the family who had a diamond in their own house and threw it away like a piece of trash. Her perfect, curated image wasn't just cracked, it had been atomized. Her panic would be all-consuming, a tidal wave of shame and humiliation. What would she tell the Abernathists now? But Serafina, her reaction would have been the most profound, the most visceral. Her entire identity, her entire life, was built on the foundation of being the golden child, the successful one, the sun in our family solar system. That foundation had just been obliterated. Her promotion, her high-powered fiancé, her wedding in Lake Como, all the things that made her feel special and superior, they were now rendered utterly insignificant. They were children's toys next to the financial empire I had built in secret. It wasn't just jealousy she was feeling. It was an existential crisis. If she wasn't the successful one, what was she? The smugness would have melted from her face, replaced by a contorted mask of raw, unfiltered rage. Her hands would have crumpled the photograph of my new home, her knuckles white. "No," she would have whispered, her voice a strangled, venomous hiss. "No, it's a lie. It's fake. She's not smart enough. She's not. She can't be." But the evidence was overwhelming, and her denial would have crumbled, leaving behind only the black, ugly truth of her own sudden, shocking irrelevance. They would have stayed there for a long time, the three of them sitting in stunned silence around that mahogany table, the documents spread out before them like the wreckage of their lives. The burden was gone, and in her place was a giant, a titan, a force of nature they had unknowingly created and unleashed. And she was just getting started. The bomb had been dropped, and the fallout was just beginning. Their burden was now one of the wealthiest young tech founders in the country. Before we get to the final, face-to-face confrontation, if you're enjoying the story of poetic justice, make sure you smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. The week that followed the detonation was a week of profound, deafening silence. From my side, at least. From their side, I know it was a maelstrom. My phone, the old one I'd left behind, was a ghost limb I could feel vibrating from miles away. It would have been a relentless barrage of calls and texts, a frantic, chaotic attempt to breach the walls I had erected. But those walls were high and they were strong. While they were scrambling in the ruins of their old reality, I was working. I was meeting with my executive team. I was strategizing with the transition board from Intercorp, and I was overseeing the final designs for our new R&D campus. I was building my future, brick by brick, while they were sifting through the rubble of their past. I let them stew in that silence for 7 full days. I let their panic fester, let their greed curdle into a desperate, frantic need. I knew my father would be trying to pull strings, calling contacts to get a meeting with me, only to find himself stonewalled at every turn. I knew my mother would be in a state of social hibernation, too humiliated to face her friends. And I knew Serafina would be consumed by a rage so potent it was likely making her physically ill. They were used to being in control. I had taken that away from them. Now, I was going to give them exactly what they thought they wanted, a meeting. The invitation was not sent for me. It came, once again, via the silent, black-suited couriers from Faro, Lynch, and Sterling. The language was cold, corporate, and deliberately vague. They were invited to a meeting to discuss the orderly dissolution of prior familial financial ties. For my mother, the word dissolution would have sounded like a death knell, but for my father and Serafina, the phrase financial ties would have been an irresistible bait. It was a glimmer of hope, a negotiation, a chance to get a peace. They believed they were being called to the table to discuss their cut. They had no idea they were being summoned to their own execution. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday at 10 a.m. on my turf. Not my home, not my new office, but a place of pure, unadulterated power, the main boardroom on the 50th floor of my lawyer's firm. I can only imagine their ride up that elevator, a silent, chrome-and-glass box ascending into the sky, taking them further and further away from the world they knew. When the doors opened, they would have been met by a receptionist who greeted them without a flicker of recognition and led them down a long, white marble hallway. The boardroom itself was a masterpiece of intimidation. A single, massive table of black granite sat in the center of a room enclosed on 3 sides by floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic, godlike view of the city below. There was no art on the walls, no family photos, no warmth. It was a cold, sterile environment designed for one purpose: to make the people on the other side of the table feel very, very small. My lawyers were already there. Mr. Farrow, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, reptilian eyes, and Ms. Lynch, a woman with a razor-sharp mind and a presence that could curdle steel. They would have gestured for my family to sit, leaving the seat at the head of the table conspicuously empty. The 3 of them, my father, my mother, and my sister, sat huddled together on one side, looking like shipwreck survivors clinging to a piece of driftwood. They were used to being the ones who commanded a room. Here, they were nothing more than scenery. The door opened at precisely 10:01 a.m., and I made my entrance. I had spent an hour that morning choosing my armor. It wasn't the quiet, unassuming clothes of a Lowen Ellington. It was a bespoke power suit in a shade of dark charcoal, tailored so perfectly it looked like it was forged onto me. My hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon. My face was a neutral mask, my expression calm, my eyes clear and unreadable. I was flanked on either side by Mr. Farrow and Ms. Lynch. We advanced towards the table, not as a family member arriving for a chat, but as a delegation arriving for a summit. I took my seat at the head of the table, placing my portfolio down with a soft, definitive click. The power shift in the room was palpable. It was a physical force, a change in the atmospheric pressure. I was no longer the ghost in the corner. I was the sun, and there were just 3 cold, desperate planets caught in my orbit. I didn't say a word. I just looked at them, my gaze sweeping over each of their faces, and I waited. The silence was my opening statement. My father, Richard, ever the businessman, broke first. He cleared his throat, forcing a wide, unnatural smile onto his face. It was his deal-making smile, the one he used when he was about to swindle a competitor. "Eloin," he began, his voice a low, conspiratorial boom. "Incredible. Absolutely incredible. A $350 million exit. That's a ruthless strategy. You have my killer instinct, you know. I always knew you had it in you." I remained silent, my expression unchanged. He pressed on, mistaking my silence for consideration. "I've been looking over the market projections for Intercorp since the news broke. With your ether technology integrated, their stock is going to soar. But there are ancillary markets they're overlooking. Data security, predictive insurance, algorithms. We could build a new entity. You and me. The Ellington name has weight, and with your genius, think of the synergy. We could build a true family legacy and empire." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with avarice. He saw me not as his daughter, but as a new company he could merge with, a new asset to be exploited. He was praising the knife I had built, completely oblivious to the fact that it was pointed at his own chest. When he finished, my mother, Caroline, began her performance. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her lower lip trembling. She placed a hand on her heart, her expression a carefully crafted mask of maternal pain. "Richard, please, this isn't about business," she whispered, her voice choked with manufactured emotion. "Eloin, darling, look at us. We're your family." Actual tears began to well in her eyes. It was an impressive display. "We love you. We've always loved you. Maybe we didn't always show it in the right way. Parents make mistakes, darling. We're not perfect. But our love for you has always been unconditional." That night at dinner, things were said, people were tired. "Can't you find it in your heart to forgive us? To let us be a family again? We miss you so much." It was a masterful performance, worthy of an award. She spoke of unconditional love, but my mind was a cold, perfect archive of every condition, every benchmark I had failed to meet. Every moment her love had been withheld because I wasn't the daughter she wanted for her curated exhibit of a life. And then it was Seraphina's turn. But she wasn't there to grovel. She was there to fight. Her face was a pale, tight mask of pure, venomous rage. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the granite table. "Don't listen to them," she spat, her voice a low, shaking hiss directed at me. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Sitting there like you're some kind of queen. Where did you get it, huh? Where did you get the idea for this ether analytics? You're not a genius. You're a thief. You probably stole the code from someone at college. I know you did. You were always sneaky, always hiding in your room, plotting. This is all a lie, a big, elaborate fraud, and when they find out, you'll have nothing. You are nothing. You're just the same pathetic little burden you've always been." She was breathing heavily, her eyes wild. It was a desperate, flailing attack, an attempt to provoke me, to drag me down into the mud with her, to get a reaction that would prove I was still the emotional, insecure little sister she could control. I let her tirade hang in the air, letting the ugly, pathetic sound of it fade into the oppressive silence of the boardroom. I had let them all have their say. The businessman, the weeping mother, the raging narcissist. They had played all their cards. Now it was my turn. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the ice water my lawyer had placed in front of me. I set the glass down, the soft click echoing in the room. I looked at my father first. My voice, when I finally spoke, was calm, level, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the voice I used to close a deal. "Synergy," I said, the word tasting like poison. "An empire, a family legacy. These are interesting concepts, Richard. But a legacy is built on a foundation of truth. My killer instinct, as you call it, was not inherited. It was forged. It was forged on my 16th birthday, when you handed me a gift card because you'd forgotten I existed. It was forged every time you looked at my academic achievements and saw a liability instead of an asset. You taught me that worth is transactional. So, let's be transactional. You have nothing I want or need. The Ellington legacy, as it pertains to me, is insolvent." I turned my gaze to my mother. The tears on her face seemed to freeze. "Unconditional love," I said, my voice just as cold, just as precise. "That's a beautiful sentiment, Caroline. But love isn't a word you say when you need something. It's an action. Love would have been defending me at that dinner table. Love would have been seeing the science fair project I spent a month building, instead of comforting the person who destroyed it. You don't miss me. You miss the idea of me, the quiet, compliant daughter who made your life easier. But what you really miss, what you truly fear losing, is your social standing. Your performance is noted, but the role of forgiving daughter has been cut from this production." Finally, I looked at Seraphina. Her face was a mess of shock and hatred. I leaned forward slightly, my eyes locking with hers. "A thief? A liar? A burden?" I let the words hang between us. "You're right about one thing. I was always plotting in my room. While you were out spending their money, I was learning. While you were basking in their praise, I was building. You accuse me of stealing my success because your mind is too small to comprehend that it could be earned. You could have been my partner. You could have been my sister. But you chose to be my bully. And you have no idea how much I owe you. Your cruelty was the final, critical line of code in my operating system. It taught me that I could expect no help, and therefore, I had to rely on no one but myself. I leaned back in my chair, my voice dropping to an almost conversational tone, but it cut through the room like a surgeon's scalpel. The purpose of this meeting is to discuss the dissolution of financial ties. Serafina, you were quite vocal about the burden of my college loans on the family's resources. I slid a single document across the polished black table towards her. This is a confirmation notice from the university. Your burden has been relieved. I've paid them off. In full. Consider it a final severance package. I stood up, my movement signaling the end of the meeting. I looked down at the three of them, three shattered people, their masks of greed, sorrow, and rage all fallen away, leaving only pale, pathetic shock. You said you wanted to live without me, I said, my eyes fixed on my sister. I'm here today to grant you that wish. My lawyers have a non-contact order prepared. It stipulates that you will make no attempt to contact me, my company, or any of my associates ever again. Sign it, and you will never have to be burdened by my existence again. I turned without another glance. Our business is concluded. I walked towards the door, my heels clicking with sharp, final finality on the marble floor. I didn't look back. I left them there, trapped in that glass box in the sky, with my lawyers and the paperwork that would legally erase me from their lives. The ghost was gone, and the reckoning was complete. Walking out of that boardroom wasn't like closing a door on my past. It was like stepping through a portal into my future. The air in the hallway felt lighter. The view from the elevator felt clearer. The weight that I had carried for 24 years, the constant, grinding pressure of being a disappointment, had been placed back on the table where it belonged. It was their burden now. I, for the first time in my life, was free. My new life didn't begin with a lavish party or a spending spree. It began with the quiet, simple joy of work. I poured myself into ether analytics, into the beautiful, logical world we had built. There are flashes of memory from that time that I hold onto like jewels. A late-night brainstorming session with Liam and Maya. The three of us crowded around a whiteboard, our laughter echoing in the vast, empty office as we solved an impossible problem. The moment I stood before my entire team, hundreds of the brightest minds in the industry, and announced the successful integration with Intercorp, not as a CEO delivering a speech, but as a proud collaborator sharing a victory. And quiet moments, too, sitting on the deck of my new home, the one from the photograph, with a cup of tea and a book, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, with no one to please, no one to perform for. The silence was no longer oppressive, it was peaceful. The smiles on my face were no longer a mask, they were real. As for the Ellingtons, their fate was a story that trickled back to me in hushed whispers from old acquaintances and gossipy articles in society pages. The bomb I had dropped in that boardroom had a blast radius that engulfed their entire world. The story was simply too scandalous, too delicious to be contained. The tale of the neglected burden who secretly became a tech titan was the talk of their elite social circle. My mother, Caroline, became a pariah overnight. Her perfect family image was shattered, and she was seen not with envy, but with a humiliating pity. Serafina's downfall was even more spectacular. Her fiancé, James, came from a family that valued power and prestige above all else. The scandal, coupled with the shocking revelation that his bride-to-be was now the less successful, less wealthy sibling, was an unacceptable stain on their reputation. The engagement was quietly and swiftly called off. The wedding in Lake Como never happened. Serafina lost the one thing she had built her entire identity around, her status as the golden child. And my father, Richard, the man who saw the world as a balance sheet, finally had to face a loss he couldn't write off. His reputation in the business community suffered a critical blow. He was no longer seen as a shrewd investor, but as a fool who had failed to recognize the single greatest asset he had ever possessed. His story became a cautionary tale told in boardrooms about the high cost of overlooking talent. They were left with their grand house and their money, but their legacy, the one thing my father truly cared about, was forever tainted with the story of their greatest failure. In the end, I realized the revenge was never about their suffering. I had spent so many years in the dark. I had no interest in dragging them down there with me. My success wasn't a weapon meant to destroy them. It was a key forged in the fires of their indifference that I used to unlock my own cage. The money, the company, the house, they were just the wonderful byproducts of my real victory. The true prize was the freedom to finally define myself for myself. The greatest revenge wasn't in making them see my worth. It was in building a life so full and so bright that I no longer needed them to see it at all. And that's the story of how I went from being the family burden to building an empire they could only dream of. If this story gave you a sense of satisfaction, please share it with a friend who might need a little inspiration. Don't forget to check out another one of our stories right here. Until next time, remember, your worth is not determined by those who refuse to see it.